Okay. So I guess I can introduce you, or since it's just the four of us, I guess you can introduce yourself.
And I'll go around and introduce ourselves. I think that might work too. So I'll start. So I thank you for joining. I'm Vanya Malloy. I'm the director and chief curator of the Syracuse University Art Museum. And I'm really excited to be here to be able to talk to you about strategies for teaching with the museum collection. And since it's only you on this event, I'd love to, for you to introduce yourself, but also for you to tell me a little bit about what you're studying and what you're teaching, so I can kind of personalize my presentation to what might be of interest to you.
Well, I am Azadeh. I'm in the writing program. The official title is Composition and Cultural Rhetoric. So our field is preoccupied with communication, persuasion, disinformation, things like that. My specific interests are on international and political asylum and human rights rhetorics. I'm especially interested in Middle East-US relations and how political asylum functions to sort of mediate those relationships. And I did actually see the posting for the museum internship this summer, so that looks really cool.
Oh, great.
I haven't interacted much with that institution, so it looks really promising and has like anti-colonial resonances, which definitely aligns with my own ethical commitments. So yeah, I'm Azadeh. Thank you guys for having this and not canceling, even though I'm the only one. It's good to be here.
That's great. Well, thank you for joining us. And I think it's always nice to have a small group or in an individual in this case, because then we can really have more of a discussion.
Yeah.
Glenn and Sean, did you want to introduce yourselves or say anything?
I'm Sean Lohner, TA program coordinator. Yeah, I guess that's about it. Thank you for coming out. Yeah, and thank you, Vanya, for agreeing to do this.
I'm Glenn Wright. I'm director of programs for the graduate school. So I think this is one of the unexpected benefits of this past semester has been becoming acquainted with Vanya and the great work at the SU Art Museum and certainly all the activity that you've had recently just in terms of elevating that institution. You're all over the SU events calendar with kind of spreading the word about the fact that this really kind of incredible institution exists right in our midst, which I think a lot of people it was largely off their radar. I mean, I know for years I've been on campus. Sean and I used to work over in Bown Hall right next to Schaefer, and I would stroll through Schaefer Hall and just sort of see the student work that's on display kind of in the foyer area, and then occasionally there'd be some kind of exhibit in the art gallery that I would check out. But I mean, just what I've learned from you already in our conversations about the holdings and the collection there, and just kind of the work that you have ahead in terms of making the campus community more aware of this kind of treasure sort of in our midst is great. And also your willingness to collaborate on programs like this, and the internship that Azadeh mentioned is really great. So that's been kind of a highlight of my semester, forging this connection. So thank you so much for doing this.
Well, yeah, thank you all, because honestly, it's been such a great ability to connect with the graduate school and to do these joint programs. And Glenn, what you say is exactly what I'm trying to accomplish, which is to really raise the profile of the museum. We did a survey back in October, and we realized a lot of people didn't even know we existed, much less that our collection is one of the top academic collections in the country, and it's global and has represents all these different time periods, and in many cases complements what's in special collections. So I'll talk a bit about that, and then I'll talk about some ways that you could work through teaching with the collection. But since this is such an informal session, it's just a small group, feel free to interrupt me as I'm talking. I know when I share the PowerPoint, it can kind of feel like I'm just in presentation mode, but I'd rather it be more of a conversation. So I'll start out with this PowerPoint I prepared. Here we are. Here we go. And The first thing I want to share, and you may already be familiar with it, you may not, is the museum's mission statement. This is recently updated. And we're working right now through a new strategic plan with the university that as we prepare for accreditation. So we're hoping to get the museum accredited. And the kind of the big takeaway is that we really differentiate ourselves from, a lot of people say, well, there already is a museum in town. There's the Everson, right? And the Everson is a civic museum, and it is in Syracuse. But their function is to serve, really the whole community, and through exhibitions and public programming. We see ourselves, we are here for the whole community too, but we really see ourselves as a place for teaching and research at SU as a core resource for these things, and to be more experimental. So for instance, you can look through our database and you can find works that you're like, oh, these are interesting, Vanya. Can I come in and look at them? And we'll say, absolutely. And we'll pull the files and we'll meet with you. We'll talk to you about how you could use them for your research or for teaching. Civic museums don't do that. That's not really their mission. And academic museums, that is our mission, right? Our mission is to really integrate the collection into the way people are teaching, into the way they're doing research, into the way they're having discussions, and thinking kind of more broadly. But we're also here to promote mindfulness. That is, like, you might not be interested in the museum whatsoever in terms of a resource for your research or teaching, but we are still a resource that you can come and enjoy the work. You can use it as a break for, if you're stressed out, for everybody. And I keep encouraging people to do that, because even during the pandemic, we're open right now to the SU community. Typically, we're open to everybody free of charge, no matter if they're part of the SU community or not. And we want at that level for everyone to be able to see the museum as a resource. But even for research, even if you're not a scholar and you're a community member and you're just interested in something, everyone has the ability to ask to see a work in person, and do research on it through our collection. So where are we? That's kind of a basic question I get a lot. We're actually, if the bus stop is right on the left to the image on the left, like you walk by the main bus stop and you're on the main quad. This is the Schaefer Art Building. We're right there, kind of at the first entrance. Right now, we put up, a lot of folks didn't know where we are, so we put up this like window cling signage to try to draw more attention, because we don't have our own building. We're within a building. But if you were to walk through the doors, you would see what's on the right here, which is a recently done redesign of for our entrance, and by a local artist who's also faculty at SU. That just kind of points to tells you you're in the right spot. This is the museum, and you enter through the glass doors. How did we get here as a collection? So a lot of folks will say, okay, I've never heard of the Syracuse University Art Museum, and that's because our name's new. We changed our name recently. It was February of 2019, so literally right before the pandemic broke. We had a name change. We were all excited about all the things that are going to happen. Then we were told, don't come back to work. The pandemic has started. But we've been in existence for a really long time. And one kind of thing that, I've been doing some research, because I did a general intro to the museum talk just 2 days ago. And what's interesting is, who started our collection? It was actually George Fisk Comfort, and his name may ring familiar because he's the same person who started the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And he's the same person who started the Everson. So in 1873, he was the dean. He was the very first dean of SU's College of Fine Arts. And he started the baccalaureate program, the BA program in fine arts, and the first one in the nation, actually. And he's a really huge advocate of education through art. So he believed it strongly and that drove kind of the founding of the Met, that, art is important for education for everybody, and everyone should have access. But also he believed it in his role as an educator at SU. And so the first thing he did is he started with these plaster casts, buying them for use for studying for fine art students, right? And so you could see, for instance, the very famous Winged Victory on the left, that's at the Louvre. It's a ancient work that is, still kind of an art, it's not preserved in its full, it's missing its arms, its head, and other parts of its body, but a lot of it is still intact to the point where you can still see how impressive it was in terms of its use of drapery and motion for the figure. And here on the right is a replica that was done in 1894, and that's now in the Hall of Languages. But it was, it gave these students a connection to these important historic works of art that they wouldn't have got in a time period where there wasn't the same kind of technology we have today. There, no internet or anything like that. So it gave them access to important artworks. And that collection then continued to grow. So it didn't stop with plasters. It started with acquiring artwork. It then evolved into, in 1889, a gallery museum that was for the presentation of the university's artwork, so paintings and these kind of plaster casts. And it continued to grow into what is now one of the largest collections in the country for an academic museum. This is when we look at the top 50 or so academic museums in the country and their collection sizes, you'll see the vast majority have between 1 and 10,000 works, or 10 to 20. We're at about 45,000, and it puts us on the far right, where if you look at who else is with us, it's Yale and Harvard and really the top Ivy League schools. So it's something we should be really proud of, and it's a collection that we really should be utilizing for research, for teaching, and for discussion, because it's such a large and extensive and important collection. Now, when I talk about ways you can use the collection, I mentioned, the museum itself, the facility, but for teaching, sometimes it might make more sense to also point you to the direction, especially during COVID, of our website. So our website, we've updated it quite a bit recently. It's got a lot of virtual exhibitions on it. It's got ability to search the collection. So if you click on the art tab there, it'll kind of bring you to search the collection. And here you are where you see these packages. So the packages are created by staff at the museum, and it's sometimes like themed, like Valentine's Day. This is, we did a package for then. And that's the idea, that we can go through all the works and we just can click on them and create a package that becomes its own link. So for instance, if you were teaching a class and you had a group of objects that you thought were really interesting, you wanted your students to look at, rather than sending them individually to different links, you could say, Vanya, could you create a package for me and label it whatever, and I could do that, it could appear on this page, and then I could send you a link, and your students can look at it that way. And then, this is kind of how it is. You can click on Art on Campus package, and then unfortunately this is a screenshot, but you could scroll down or just click View All Works and see all of them. There's the ability to have text with these objects. So for instance, object labels, sometimes we have object labels that are very specific to a show, and we'll only put up for a certain kind of exhibition, but sometimes we have very good general object labels, like that gives a general overview of an artwork, and we could include those too. Like, so when you click on an artwork in that package, it has that text. So that's kind of more of the browsing feature for people who are trying to discover the collection, see what they have, or have these packages for classes or for specific events. But let's say you just wanted to explore what is it we have. The advanced search, so that's another option. Actually, let me show you, because it's hidden right here it says advanced search. So if you get to this page and you click that, it'll take you to this here. To this here. And you can search in advanced search through all these specific things. Like you can search for anything with the title of, I don't know, portrait, or the title of woman, or, you can pick whatever topic you wanted, or you can do that in keyword too, if you're looking. Or let's say maybe you wanted to see all the depictions of Venus, the goddess Venus, you could put in Venus and see, but keyword would also work there. Dates, you can select a range if you have a specific date you're looking for, same with medium. And then same here with these classifications. You can say, I just want to see all your artist books, because we have a lot of works that are artist books created by artists. Or I want to only look at things that are animations, or that are, I'm trying to think what other drawings or things of that sort. So you can really be very specific about what you want. So these are all kind of big picture ways to teach with the collection. You can use the database, like you can tell students to research and see what they find. You can create a package of works that you've pre-selected for students to look at. You can use our online exhibitions. So as I pointed out, we do, especially right now during COVID, we've mirrored all our in-person exhibitions to online ones. But we also have the ability, let's say you're working with a class and they want to do an exhibition as part of the class. That's also something we could work with you on. And it's pretty straightforward. It's not very difficult on our end to do it. It used to be a lot more involved, but we've changed software systems. So there's more possibility there than there was before. Then you could take them to see an in-person exhibition. Right now we have an MFA show, but we also have 2 other exhibitions up on view. And we're going to have, for instance, an exhibition on Native American art in the fall that it's an external show coming from the State Museum in Albany. And we also have permanent collections that are also on view. So selections from the permanent collection. We have study cabinets. These are kind of unusual, and I wish I had a picture of them, but I don't. But that's essentially like, let's say you wanted to select a group of work that are works on paper, and you wanted your students to be able to come in anytime when the museum's open and look at them. So there are these cabinets that we frame the works and we put them on, and they can kind of leaf through the works, and they can study them in person without having to make an appointment because they're mounted on in these cabinets. And each cabinet can fit about 20 works, depending upon their size. I mean, smaller works. And that's for photographs, drawings, but it has to be 2D works mainly. Then you can do an in-person individual viewing appointment. Like, let's say you say, I want to use a certain group of things for a class, but I want to look at them first. So you can make an appointment with me or with my staff, and we could pull those works for you and show it to you. Or you could say, I want to look at them with my class, and you can make an appointment. We'll pull the works and bring it and your class could come at a certain time whenever we, make the appointment for, and look at them as a group. And the last option is a personalized group tour, which is to say, let's say you wanted to look at an exhibition that's on view, but you wanted someone from the staff, like the curator, to give a tour of it for your class. We could do that, or to give a talk on any other material in the collection. We can do that. And we're also happy to help co-teach. Like, for instance, if you wanted to bring a class to look at a certain number of works, and you wanted museum staff to give an intro on the background, the art historical background of certain works, and then you take it from there, talking about whatever your focus is, we could do that too. So that we're very collaborative in that way. We're happy to work with you. And there's many options. I should also point out that in addition to the actual physical object, we have other types of information on the work. We have donor files. So if you're interested in like where an object came from, how did it end up here, we have information about that. And we have object files. So sometimes people have already researched an object extensively, found where it was published or cited, and then we try to keep all that in a file so that people aren't having to redo research, right? So that the first thing you do is say, let me look at what's been done first and read through it, and then I know what has to be done next. Because sometimes the stuff that you're like, oh, I got to get this book and read this article, and a photocopy of that article from the book is in the file, so it kind of saves you some time. And this is just a screenshot of like one of the virtual exhibitions. So, you would like click on this Being Human show, which was up this year. It was a permanent collection exhibition we did during COVID. And you could kind of leaf through the exhibition virtually. It doesn't give you the installation shots that you would see if you were seeing it in person, but it does give you some overview. So, big picture, there's about 3 different strategies you can you could apply to teaching with an art collection at the museum. The first one is, I would say, the more traditional one. Maybe it's not traditional by our historical scope, but it's kind of what a lot of us tend to do, which is to use an individual object as an interdisciplinary tool to spin out narratives that begin with the object and end wherever your research or observations take you. So that could be, for instance, the example of the still life with fruit painting, right? You could, let's say you're interested in colonialism and globalism, and you're interested in trade and labor. You could look at this first in terms of its composition and what it looks like, but then you could start asking questions about where does the fruit, where was this made? where is this artist from? Where did this fruit come from? Where did this food come from? And who made this food, right? And then what is it trying to communicate through this opulent display? Still lifes are actually a really interesting way of diving into this kind of global commerce question and about labor questions, and especially unethical labor and colonialism, slave trade, forced labor. I mean, there's a lot of deep topics that come out of still lives that people are often surprised about. But if you just dig into what you're seeing, the time period it came from, and then how did it get there, oftentimes there's a lot of really rich discussion that can come out of it. And actually, this one's not from our collection, but I included it because I went to a really great talk on it at Oberlin College. And it's a painting that's at LACMA. And I just wanted to just throw it out there because it opened my mind about how still life, which can look very unassuming, can actually have a lot of deeper meaning to it. So Robert Duncanson was a Hudson River School painter, meaning American painter in the 1900s, in this case 1850s, so late 1800s, early 1900s, and he 19th century, I wanted to say, not 1900s, but he essentially was from Ohio and worked mainly in Ohio and became a very accomplished painter of still life and of scenic kind of the landscape, the natural landscape of the area. As you know, he also was very active abolitionist and was really interested in how he could use his kind of position as an artist that was being essentially his patrons were people who were influential, right? People who were buying his art had power, and he had the ability through his art to persuade conversations through what he chose to represent. And so here you see a topic of a still life. And in many cases, people look at it and say, it's a really okay, it's a still life. There's nothing too exciting about it. But the scholar who was speaking about it did a lot of research and realized of all the still lifes she could find, I mean, she did her PhD on this and looked at like thousands and thousands of still lifes. There are only 4 that ever depict honeycomb. Why did he choose to depict honeycomb? And so she did a lot of research of what was going on in 1849 in Ohio, where he was from. And what was going on was there was a lot of intentional activism to stop using sugar, because sugar was a product of forced labor, of slave labor. And how can people boycott sugar? What should they do? Well, they should buy honey and sweeten their food with honey. And the same thing with pineapple. Pineapple was a fruit that was a product of forced labor. It was imported into the United States in Ohio at that time period. And here, you know, this is more of an interpretation, but she's like, you know, most times when you see a pineapple, it's very lush, it's very upright. And here it's kind of looking kind of like it's past its prime, it's falling down. And she says, even that she believes is very much a commentary on like not preferring to use like choosing the apple and the honeycomb, which are local to the area and that don't rely on forced labor, over this other food, which does. And you know, her research showed not only kind of ads in the newspaper that were being put out by Duncanson and by his colleagues saying, you know, urging people to be a lot more critical consumers and what they're choosing to purchase for food products. So it really kind of puts it into a bigger picture and suddenly shows you how this painting is an activist painting in many ways, which at first glance, you wouldn't have known without doing that kind of research and then being able to have that conversation. And I think that's important to keep in mind, that so much of, you know, maybe in this time period, when someone saw this in Ohio, they would have seen it and said, oh yeah, they know exactly what it's about. But a lot of that is lost on us over time because we're not tuned in to the politics and to the visual cues of what was important then. Today, it's a loss with time. And so history and research has to recreate it. Same with, you know, you think of like the Twitter icon or like things like that. Like, you know, I'm pretty sure in 200 years, if someone sees that, they're going to be like, it's some weird blue bird. Like, what's that about? and they're not going to know, and they're going to have to do the research and reconnect it and understand more. So a lot of times, one visual exercise that I've seen done with, especially with still life, is to ask people, students, to make their own still life, to say, okay, we all have our, for the most part, a camera on our phone or something of that sort. Why don't you create a still life? Like, you take a photograph of what is important to you. And what you realize through that process is that usually it's very intentional in terms of what people choose, but also sometimes that it even communicates more than you think it does, to other people. So I think the way that images communicate are really important source of discussion for students to understand, both in how the art is intentional, how he crafts things or she crafts things intentionally, but also in terms of what they say that maybe aren't intentional. Okay.
Vanya,
So
what is LACMA?
Los Angeles County Museum of Art.
Okay.
It's a pretty major museum in Los Angeles. They have an amazing collection. Yeah. But they're not an academic museum. So if you went over there and you said, let me see these paintings, they would probably laugh at you, because I've got over there and I'm like, I'm doing my PhD. You have like the most important thing in my work, and they would not give me access. They're like, sorry, we don't have the resources. I'm like, you don't have the resources. You're one of the wealthiest museums in the country. But it just goes to show that, their priority is very different than an academic museum, where we feel like that's our purpose to be here. And their purpose is these exhibitions that often travel the world too. So this is one of our examples of a public work in the museum's collection. So not all our works are on site. Some of them are public works that are across campus. Ben Shahn is a really important artist. And, he's someone that his work is really well known. We have some other works of his in our collection, including a painting, some drawings. But this is a very well-known work, which actually MoMA has a study of it, and they actually show it quite a lot in their exhibition. So it's very high profile, and it's a mosaic. So if you look at it, it's very much textured. Sometimes the little pieces of mosaic, they do fall out. They need to be conserved. So there's that whole process too about how one cares for an artwork, how it may change over time through just being in a lived environment. But the topic here is Sacco and Vanzetti, that case, the very famous case where Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, who were Italian immigrants and anarchists, were executed for murder by the state of Massachusetts in 1927 on the basis of very doubtful ballistic evidence. And, a lot of people believed and still believe that, they were not guilty, and it was really that the people didn't like their politics, and that's why they were killed. So this grave injustice that happened. So again, 1927, we're not quite at 100 years from that yet, but we're approaching sooner than later 100 years. And I think it's a really important topic to talk about social justice historically and bring it into current day. There's a lot of thinking about public work as well. I mean, public work is very different in the way it interacts with a person than a private work, in the sense that when it's out in the public, if you think about, and I talked about this in another workshop I had done, there's a work in our collection by James Earl Fraser, and I didn't put it in this PowerPoint, but it's that big monument that is in front of the Natural History Museum in New York City of Theodore Roosevelt. And that work is very problematic in its depiction of Roosevelt, with next to him, he's on a horse high up, and next to him is supposed to be a man from Africa and a Native American man. And the structure of it, a lot of the details of it, there's a lot of problems with it. And what's really, I think, enlightening in that discussion is people say, because it's a public work, it's something like I have to see, I am forced to see as I walk into the Natural History Museum. I'm forced to see it as I walk down the street. It confronts me every day, versus in a museum, I can choose not to go into that gallery or into that museum. So it's a work that engages people in their daily life, whether they want to engage with it or not. And therefore, oftentimes there's a higher standard for public work, and it does result in more discussion and more engagement with the community. So I think there's right now, the Mellon Foundation, for instance, has given $500 million in grant money that they've opened up for research and topics about monuments specifically, because there is such a big rethinking of public work and monuments in this country. So it's certainly a relevant topic, and public work is really important in that way. So this work can certainly be discussed in that format as well. Another example I wanted to show you, just to kind of give you a bigger range, is this is a new acquisition. So the museum is continuously acquiring new work, and we've recently shifted our acquisitions to BIPOC artists, to really try to improve the representation in our collection, and to form relationships with these artists, not just to purchase works from them one time and that's it, but rather to engage with them, invite them to campus to give talks, and to do more projects with us. So Ivan Ford, we purchased 2 photographs of his. We did an exhibition of his in our New York City venue. We have a gallery in New York called the Palitz Gallery. That's a part of the Lubin House, the Syracuse University Lubin House. But we also are just now talking with him, and he's going to be coming, I think, next week or the week after to Syracuse to do a bigger mural project for us, and actually to do a series of mural projects, so that every year we engage with a different contemporary artist to do an art wall, so to speak, and to have them do public programming for us so that they can reach students in the community. So that, again, is something that you can invite your students to if they're interested. Ivan is very interested in epic poetry. That's one of his main focuses. So for instance, when I was talking to him about this work and said, well, what was the inspiration behind this work? He depicts himself in his work. So that's actually him. Obviously he doesn't have several eyes. He's did a digital collage. But he was saying, that when he reads epic poetry, he often thinks about, the story and what would be, like himself in that story, but also what it would be if the story was different. And so kind of, it was the process of his eyes moving by reading, but also kind of the process of him thinking through the potential, right? The potential of if the narrative were different. So we, in addition to new acquisitions, which there's a lot of exciting new ones, and artists that come and give talks, our collection is extensive. So depending upon what you might want to talk about, there's a lot of different material. Anna Hyatt Huntington, I mentioned her because she's a really important artist from the 19th century, and early in 20th century, who became independent in a time period when a lot of women artists were not successful. I mean, could not even dream of being independent. So one of the ways she became independent was she actually made these small scale statues for the home. And she really was able to anticipate a market for it. And, here, this is kind of a classical topic, Diana of the Chase, and, very classical depiction of the drapery. Kind of reminds me of the Nike sculpture we were looking at the plaster before, and the human figure, and she's balanced on a ball. So there's all this idea of beauty, but also the story of Diana. But it was actually the marketability of making smaller scales, because sculpture they're cast in editions, kind of like photography or prints. Like you don't usually just make one, especially in this case where it's a cast work. You can make 50, or you can make 20, or so long as you have the plaster, you can make as many as you decide you want to make. And you can make them in different scales too. So she was someone who really developed this market, especially in New York City, and became very independently wealthy and successful by doing it. And then she left her estate to Syracuse. So we have her papers at Special Collections, all her writing, and we also have her artwork at the museum. So that's one example of where there's that crossover between the material in Special Collections and the material in the museum. There's a lot of overlap like that. And the person I mentioned to you before, the George Fisk Comfort, all his papers are also at Special Collections. So if anyone wanted to read about him or learn more about art education that he envisioned, you could probably do that there. Now we have another one of her works. It's a terrible image and I hate it, but it's the best one I have. And it's Joan of Arc, 1922. So the reason I bring this one up is also thinking about, this is in our collection. This is from her. But she did Joan of Arc in more than one instance. Earlier in 1915, she did the first public sculpture in New York City of a female figure that's not a mythical or not a allegorical figure. So Joan of Arc was a real person, and she's a very independent woman shown here. And so this is, in feminist critique of our history, like this is seen as a really important milestone work done by a woman artist in a public place. It's a public sculpture empowering women. And so thinking about Anna Hyatt Huntington as someone who was an independent, successful woman in a time period, also furthering that image of independent women in public spaces. Then, there's a lot of other topics you could do. So Alan Dunn and Petty Dunn, if you look kind of down here at the accession line, Mary Petty and Alan Dunn, they were social cartoonists. And they did a lot of these types of, this is one example, this is by Alan Dunn, of social cartooning that was then published, in its own time period in different magazines and journals and so forth. So if you're looking into kind of how are ideas being communicated to a general audience about current events and current things going on, that's a wealth of resource there in terms of what we have. It's a huge collection, and we not only have the collection, but then someone donated to us an entire library of books that relate to social cartooning. So if you wanted to do research on Alan Dunn and kind of learn more about him, or Mary Petty, and learn more about her, we have all of these books about not only them, but also about their peers and other people who are doing social cartooning in this time period. So our books are something that people don't really know we have. We have a huge art library. So for most artists we collect, not all, but for most, we do have books on them. And that's available to anyone who's interested in looking at them. Another kind of more on the terms of social communication artist in our collection is Boris Artsebachev. And as you can see here, these are studies, and he did covers of many, many, many different Time magazines, a lot of times depicting dictators, depicting important scientists, depicting presidents. And they're oftentimes, I don't have any examples here, but oftentimes kind of caricatures of them. So it's not just a very realistic depiction, but it's kind of what he's trying to communicate about them. And, in addition to depicting people, he also depicted things that were ongoing in society. So here's a map of manufacturing and assembly plants for Ford Motor Company. And this is something in our collection that he did. So you can kind of get an idea of all of this manufacturing spreading across the United States. And you can certainly talk about that topic of labor and industrialization through images by him, but certainly also about politics, about current events, about how they were being communicated, and a number of other things through those works. Now, Bernice Abbott, she's really important. That's why I always bring her up, because she's a really important female photographer. And most places are really excited if they have like 5 of her works. We have 770. We have an enormous collection, and it's just amazing that we got it. And she depicted quite a lot of different things, including industry. So here's the Ballantine beer plant. That was like it was like the Budweiser beer back in the 1930s. A lot of people were drinking Ballantine beer. But I had more images in my class presentation, but she also depicted famous people in a very intimate way that she knew. There's an exhibition she identified as a lesbian. And so she had many different friends who identified also as gay. And she took portraits of them. And that's actually a student has curated a virtual exhibition that's up right now on our website from those portraits. So I think that's really very important too, to think about her work in terms of her identity. But then she also she was interested in science. So she worked at MIT for a number of years and depicted like scientific phenomena like magnetism racism and different things like that, and also in nature and thinking about the fishing industry in Maine and how the landscape was being affected. So she's someone who really, she had a long career and she didn't focus on just one thing. So there's many different types of discussions that can be had with her work, but she's just one photographer out of many in our collection. So our collection of photography is about 9,000 works. So we have, you know, many different artists. We have about 20,000 works on paper, and then the remainder are paintings and cultural artifacts, sculptures, textiles. So we have many, many different types of art, but photography and works on paper like drawings and prints and watercolor are very large in our collection. And I also just wanted to point out, you know, we're talking about factory worker. You can have a conversation about, you know, factory workers in the United States, but then also factory workers in other parts of the world. So these are Japanese factory workers. And this is by an unknown photographer in our collection. We have a number of those as well that are more documentary, depicting about a certain time period and place and the people there. So that's strategy number one, where you're kind of really just looking deeply at a work and you're kind of digging through what you're seeing, and then you're allowing it to inform, you know, what you know, whatever topic it is that you're interested in researching. So, you know, it could be industry and labor and so forth, or it could be science. I mean, there's a lot of potential there. Now, strategy number two is when you use objects in the museum for non-narrative, like you're not trying to spin out a story about it and use it to kind of teach you about a time period, but really you're asking your student, what values do objects without context present for you and your students? So it could be just, you know, looking, and I think it's really hard to do this virtually, but it's possible. But like when you see this painting in person, it's really large, right? And it's really kind of, you're standing there and he's definitely looking down at you, the way it's positioned, much bigger than you. So, you know, just to asking people like, well, what is your impression of this? Or like what is being communicated to you about it? You don't have to know it's Louis XIV. You don't have to know anything about the painter or the time period it came from. But people often, you know, would say like, well, like he's clearly very important. And like, well, what makes you feel he's important? And then you could say, well, he's really big and he's kind of towering over me. He's in this gilded frame, which you don't see in this PowerPoint. And then he's got all this fancy clothes on, you know, and the positioning of his body. So you could talk through about these cues and communication and how, you know, for instance, the idea of power is being communicated to you when you're looking at something. And that's certainly, I think, what's powerful about this work, and why certainly this was, he was the sought after painter of the court of Louis XIV and painted all his family member, is the reason that it hasn't lost its messaging over time, right? It was intended to show you this king, right, Louis XIV, as this really powerful, important person who's in regal wear and he's in charge and he's, you know, he's in on top of it and you're kind of below him. And it still does a lot of the same things today. And I think that's, you know, important to kind of think about how a image is, how the artist goes about that. Like, how is that being communicated to you? What are you seeing? And also the difference between, this is another visual exercise too, you know, asking people, what do they see in an image? Because, you know, what you see, when you're looking at something, saying I've looked at it, and to see it, you know, can be two different things. For instance, you can say, okay, take a minute, and it could be any image, and write down how many objects you see. Like how many objects come to your attention? And then, you know, have people stop and then say, okay, let's talk about it. And you'll often see that people notice different things. Sometimes they all notice one thing, right? They might notice like his sword, or I don't know, some detail that draws, but a lot of times there's subtle details that are in there that not everyone notices. And it shows you the practice of close looking. The other visual exercise that's really good to do with students, especially, and I remember this, I still remember it from when I was an art history student in my college days, is to ask someone to write, it could be with any image, but to ask them to write a description of what they're saying. So say, okay, well, it doesn't have to be like 10 pages, like write a 1-page or 2-paragraph description so that someone who's not seeing the image can understand what they're seeing. And often that too is very telling. One, you realize it's a lot harder than it seems. But two, it can be telling in terms of what people notice and how they're constructing. And it can also help them improve their visual analysis and their ability to communicate what they're saying. One activity you could do is, if you have students in the museum or even virtually, they can select images, is to have them write something and then give it to a different student, shuffle around. They each get a different writing and then try to match it up, try to find what they wrote. And sometimes, sometimes the students realize like, oh, sometimes the descriptions are great. And sometimes you realize, well, you assumed I knew this. You assumed a lot in the way you wrote something, and then people realize, oh, okay, like it could be, the exercise is interesting in terms of what it reveals. But oftentimes what it taught me when I was in college was that describing what you're seeing, and even to know how to structure where to start with what you're saying, can be very difficult. And then this is just another example of, depictions of power in the collection. So these were the Japanese emperors in 1880, emperor and empress. And what's important about these photographs is the global representation of power. So these are Western constructs of power that are being adopted by Japanese emperor and empress. And the idea is that these images wouldn't just stay in Japan, that they were globally circulated so that people understood that there were these powerhouses there that were also conforming to these Western constructs of representation of power. So that too, just asking people what they see, what they think is different in these images, what strikes their attention, that could lead to a lot of conversation and ability to exercise visual analysis. This work I think is really interesting, and I just want to share it in terms of, what you see is often not always what is being depicted. So someone who might see this image and you ask them to describe it, they could say, well, it's this young woman, she's carrying something, I'm not sure what it is. There's these other people around her who are looking on. She's in white, so maybe a sign of purity or virginity from this time period. And then if you see the title, the Vestal Virgin, for anyone who might know the story of the Vestal Virgin, she carries a sieve, like a perforated container of water from the river to, I forget where, but it's a miracle, right? The water doesn't go through the holes, it stays in there. And this act was done because she was accused of not being virtuous, and she wanted to prove that she was. So it's like this miracle happened to prove her virtue. And so you see that context and you say, oh, okay, it kind of makes sense. But with some research, it kind of reframes how you're thinking about the work, because you realize that this is actually a depiction of, and now I don't have the name of the person, but it was of the India Tea Trade Company, the mistress of the main person who ran that company. And she actually had several children out of wedlock with him in this time period. And, the contemporary, commentary on this is like, obviously she was not this virgin. And it's kind of ironic to be painting her in this portrait in this context. But what's important too, when we talk about constructs of power, is to know that the Queen Elizabeth I actually adopted this sieve kind of style of portrait, referencing the Vestal Virgin in her own depictions of herself in a time period. So thinking about how a female monarch chooses to portray themselves in alignment with this idea of chastity and virginity in that time period is interesting too. But what you see isn't, it's like the break between what you're looking at when you first see it versus what the deeper story is. And another kind of way just to do visual, analysis and kind of visual, just looking at a work are, through a more scientific lens in some ways, are Joseph Albers, his work. We have quite a lot of his work in the collection. He was a German-born artist who was active in the Bauhaus. He came to the United States and taught at the Yale University, the School of Art there. And he was really interested in vision science. So a lot of what he taught was actually what he learned through vision science, which is that color is not an absolute. The way the eye sees color is actually in relation to other things. So I can take one shade of something and put it next to one background. It looks one way. I put it next to something else. It looks a different way. And so he did a lot of these kind of visual exercises with his students. And we can still do them today. There's actually Yale University published an interactive app, so you can do it on your iPhone or iPad or whatever, and kind of see for yourself how color is this relative thing that your eye sees as, you know, one way in one context and another in a different one. And here's like one example of a portfolio sheet that's in our collection. So we have a bunch of these. This is from a really big album called Formulation Articulation. And there's a number of these works. And it's actually one sheet. So the two images are meant to be seen together. And here it's the same gray on both pages, that kind of medium gray, but it appears different to, you know, on the left and then on the right, and it's because of the different background. And so there's many different examples of this in this portfolio to kind of allow students or anyone looking at it to see how your eye perceives things differently in different contexts. So that, again, the way I actually found out about his work is when in my previous job I was at Amherst College, and I ran across this professor at Mount Holyoke who's teaching vision science, and she was teaching at the museum. And I'm like, what are you using to teach why are you bringing your students to the museum? She's like, we look at Joseph Albers' work. So we look at the impact, the way that the eye sees things differently. And so they weren't looking at it at all in terms of Joseph Albers and his impact on modern art or anything like that, but really rather how these color perception exercises that his work encourages you to do. So teaching strategy number 3. So we kind of looked at, you know, looking at a work just as an object, or looking at a work in terms of its, you know, doing research on it and its context. But then it's to think about the institution, to think about, you know, this is an art museum that collects. It's been collecting for a very long time, even before it was an art museum. And all of this, you know, can be used to teach about class, gender, race, power, politics, private property, cultural property, history, globalism, colonialism. To think about, you know, what are power constructs like in museum boards? I mean, in bigger museums, how are objects acquired? That's a big thing. Like, and what are the ethics of how they're acquired today versus in the past? And what about works that were acquired a long time ago with questionable ethics? And there could be a lot of really important conversations that come out of that. You know, this is one of our earliest works, for instance. Oops. And you know, you could talk about and it came to us with we don't really know the story. It's from 1525. We know it came with some art library books, but you know, obviously it had a really long history of ownership before it came here. So the question is like, how did it pass hands here? Who were the owners? What were the ethical questions? Are there any concerns about its ownership because it's such an old object? And that's something that there are entire people whose careers are looking at that. But then there are other works, for instance, like the Geldi mask, where I have a current student doing a lot of research on this particular work and body of work in our collection from the Yoruba people. And you know what her research is showing, for instance, is that these works were really important. They were worn and used in ceremonies to show respect to elder women and ancestors in the culture. And they were used by dance performers and rituals and ceremonies to educate about the crucial role of women and to focus on fertility, harmony, and the ideals of male and female behavior. And so she learned about how they're supposed to be worn and, you know, the process of it. But how did we get this work? And is this something, and this is a lot of times with cultural works that we don't have too much information about how we got to it. Was it ethically brought to our collection? Do we have that documentation? In a lot of collections, not ours that I know of, but a lot have funerary objects, which are really of importance to the people that they came from and shouldn't be treated as art objects. So there's a lot of ethics being involved in how people are re-examining collections and saying, just because someone gave it to you in 1969 and they took it from someone else and it's now part of the collection, doesn't mean this is where it should be. So there should be a reevaluation of some objects based on how they got to the museum. What is their intended purpose? Is it culturally appropriate to show them as artworks? And that's research that as a museum, we should be doing. And, as an academic museum, I think it's part of our role in educating students too, that they should be thinking critically about these things. So that's another avenue of research. So now I kind of went through quite a lot. Oh, I wanted to mention that in terms of also, and this is a totally just a plug really more than anything else. Our new acquisitions, a lot of artists are really that we're acquiring are really involved in social activism and thinking through a lot of these issues with colonialism and with the way that museums and cultural institutions have worked in the past. And Allison Hamilton is a brilliant artist. We just acquired her work and she's giving a talk on April 20th on Zoom. So that's something too that, if you want to hear from an artist about how they're engaging, especially with, she talks about this work in particular being inspired by historical photographs that she discovered. And then creating the work in response, that is an opportunity for your students, but also for you to hear from the artist directly, which I always think is the best if it's possible. So that's my presentation. And now I wanted to leave the remainder of the time for us to have a discussion to see, what ideas you have and, how I can be of help.
Thank you so much for that. That was really excellent. It gave me a lot of ideas for teaching writing. PhD students in my program are responsible for teaching writing 105 and writing 205, sometimes some upper division classes. And I've had some experience with teaching freshman writing. And there's usually some unit that covers visual literacies, ways of reading, these object-oriented and image-oriented kinds of literacies as we continue to live in an increasingly mediated and simulated world, right? So those kinds of seeing and interpreting are really important. And I can certainly imagine being connected to the SU Art Museum for, making those kinds of lessons more enriching for students. So thank you for doing the work that you do. I wanted to ask about whether or not there's been any conversations with the SU Art Museum and other administrators for doing arts and enrichment programs with the community of Syracuse at all. I know that SU has a history of doing community engaged works, particularly with the last chancellor, and that was kind of halted with the coming of our new chancellor and his approach. So I'm just curious with SU Art Museum, are you guys talking about, or are you in any conversation about what kinds of arts enrichment programs might happen with Syracuse, the community, right? We're 2 miles away from the north side, but it feels like we're just hundreds of years away from the north side, right? So I'm curious about that, especially with Syracuse being such an international hub, right?
Mhm.
And not just the fancy international of, students and businessmen and such, but the refugees that are such a prominent part of our community here in Syracuse. So I'm a little bit curious about if there's any conversations on that.
Absolutely. And I mean, this year has been really, really hard to do that kind of stuff with because it's been the university's decision that the campus is closed to the outside public. So we can't welcome anyone other than the campus into the museum. But we've tried as much as we can to do virtual things. And we're always open and free to all when we're not in a pandemic. So that I think helps as well. One thing we did during the pandemic to kind of a workaround, because we can't invite people into our space, is we actually partnered with local libraries to do these teaching packs with them. So that, for instance, Elizabeth Catlett is a really important artist in our collection. She is she's not alive anymore, a Black woman who also has a Mexican background. And so she lived in Mexico for a period of time, but she also was like, had a huge exhibition at the Studio Museum in Harlem in her lifetime, and was a really big social activist for empowering people. And so we were, we talked to one of the local libraries, the public library, and we're thinking about what can we do, especially for children, as an activity during COVID to help them be more engaged. So we created this packet for them where we included images by her work, some books that were thematically tied into her work, but also some prompts for them to make their own artwork about, what they envision for their society and their future, which, we got a lot of positive feedback on, and that program's still ongoing. So anyone who's interested could call, and then they would essentially give the family a packet, and they've been distributing them. So that was, COVID workaround. But typically, we engage with K through 12 students. We invite them, the schools, to come to the museum, to bring class tours. We don't have an educator, which is something I've struggled with, because a museum educator really is key for this outreach. And it's something that I'm really hoping we can get funding for or fundraise for. But even without one, one workaround that I'm thinking about is we do have an art education graduate program at the university through the school, through the School of Education and VPA jointly. And so even we've never partnered with them on using their students to be able to run some programs for K through 12. And so that's a conversation we've been having too, about being able to have more ability to have to offer more, and to have these students also have firsthand work experience for themselves, but also to use their creativity and ideas and knowledge to be able to think of different ways of programming that we can do for students. One of the issues that I've heard a lot is that the New York core curriculum, or the curriculum that they set, has made it very difficult for schools to get field trips anymore. And when they do field trips, they're almost exclusively to the Science Museum, which is not what we want to hear. So also thinking too, I think the virtual thing has opened up some ideas about maybe we can be able to offer opportunities for classes virtually, and to kind of think through different options that if they can't physically come with their class because they're not allowed to do a field trip, what else we can do. And certainly we do also family events during the weekends and things of that sort. The other big thing we're planning on, and we're not doing it now because of COVID, but we were planning on launching this summer, is we typically are closed during the summer. And I think that says a lot to our community about who we're here for. Or not here for. So one of the first things I wanted to change when I came in, and of course the pandemic didn't let me do anything so far, is to open to the community, to everybody through the summer. So that would mean for us, staging how we do the reinstalls and deinstalls in a new way. So maybe we can't fully be open if we're taking a show down and reinstalling it. But it would mean for the community that we could still have programming and invite them into our space during the summer, especially when people, I live in the community and I have children, and we're all looking for things to do with our families. And this is a really good opportunity to engage with people when there isn't too much to do, when there's less programming happening. So that's another big shift that we're hoping to make probably next summer, because this summer we're still going to be closed.
Great. Thank you so much. We're so lucky to have the museum and to have your leadership. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Any other questions or thoughts?
Vanya, I'm wondering if maybe you just have some examples of maybe some creative ways that not necessarily grad students, but faculty, whoever, may have used some of the collections in a teaching context. Just something innovative.
Yeah, so on next Friday, I had a meeting yesterday to brainstorm this, but we're using it for English as a second language students. So as a means to be able to just have a prompt to talk about what you're seeing, about what you think the interpretation might be, to be able to talk with one another as a group. So we're doing that virtually. Language classes actually use our collection a lot in terms of, it's a really good opportunity, like the French class always comes, to be able to just try talking about something like what you're seeing in this painting in a different language, or if you're learning English in English. And so that's, I think a really great, maybe not obvious approach. The other is obviously writing, where exercises in writing, describing what you're seeing, describing visual analysis. And also thinking too critically about writing. I think like there's not one way to write about art. And I think that's important for people to realize. A lot of times I've been infuriated when I see an object label and I say, wow, that's really sexist. Like the way that that was written about the subject. There is a lot of subjectivity in how we write about things. And so even teaching students about that, and to be able to say, you can write about this subject, this topic in, this way, but what does that say? Like, what are you leaving out? Like, what are you choosing in your interpretation and presenting as fact? Because there are, with every object, there's multiple narratives. There's not one. And I think that there's multiple histories, multiple stories. There's colonial portraits of women who look, beautiful, and you could talk about their gown, and you could talk about this, but you can also talk about how they made their money and how their families made their money and who they're leaving out in that discussion. So I think I think that is also for writing, especially a really important takeaway for students to realize you don't just read the label and accept it as fact. There's many different ways you can present information about an object and shift the way people see it. There's many layers in which to look at things. Any other questions for me? If not,
you mentioned at the beginning that you were you're pursuing accreditation right now. What does that mean in the art museum context? I'm used to thinking of that in terms of like academic programs. So what do you need to do to get accredited?
It's not too dissimilar. It's a lot of paperwork. So for us, we've been, you're recording this, so I'm going to be careful with what I say. But, we were under a director who had been there for a very extended length of time. And, there's a lot of documents that we should have had that we didn't have in place. For instance, we didn't have a strategic plan. Like, what is it that we're trying to accomplish as a museum? We have to have a plan, right? Like, how is that's going to inform all the decisions? It's going to inform the exhibitions we make, the type of programming we do, the work we acquire. Without one, you're kind of, I don't know, you're not really, you're kind of just winging it, so to speak. So forming a strategic plan is really key. It's something we've been now working on for a while, and it involves also getting information from various constituents and talking to various constituents, both internally at SU and the larger community. And that's why we did, I mentioned back in October, we did a survey of students, faculty, and staff. It was with the Office of Institutional Research. They randomly sent it out to select numbers on campus, I think 4,000 people, and we got 1,000 that responded. And we were able to glean a lot of important information about what students, faculty, and staff, how they perceive the museum, if they know about it, what they want to see the museum doing, what they would be interested in, what they're not interested in. And so all of this information is one way of, for one constituent group, right, the SU community, to be able to educate ourselves and inform what we will put down for our strategic plan. So that's one core document. That's what they're called, core documents. But then there's a lot of other ones, like updating our mission statement, which I showed you, which we did. The other is, disaster plan. Like, if the museum were burning down, how would you, or like if there was an issue, who would you call, so that there's this documentation. And we had one in place, but it needed to be updated. So that was good for us. And we need to do one not only for our Syracuse location, but like I mentioned, we have a New York City location. So if, let's say, there was a fire at that venue, and someone needed to call an art conservator or call these people, they needed to know who to call. So preparing that documentation. A code of ethics is another document that we're currently working on. So what is the code of ethics for the museum? There are minimal ethics that are set by our accrediting body, but we might want, and probably will want, to have additional ethics that are specific to us, that we feel strongly about. So thinking about all those things, all those documents need to be prepared And then that is one part of the review process, reviewing those documents. Even our structure, for instance, right now we don't have an advisory board. An advisory board for academic museums is very different than a board of trustees for a civic museum. So you might hear like the Sackler families, giving money, or they're on the board for one museum or whoever. And they have a lot more say. They vote on yes for an acquisition, no for an acquisition. For when you buy art, they fund a lot of it. Advisory boards for academic museums tend to not have any power whatsoever. They can't tell you can buy an artwork or you can't. They can't tell you what to do or not. They're usually just a support system. They help you fundraise. They help you network. They're people who are committed to what you're doing, and they're oftentimes alums, not always, and they help the museum grow. So they might be an art professional who introduces you to some interesting artists. They might be a collector who then gives you part of their collection or introduces you to people who would, or they might just be someone who is connected and helps you fundraise for the museum or do events in different spaces. So that's kind of a big takeaway for advisory board. But I do want to point out, if we're talking about ethics, why an advisory board is so should raise some flags with people when they think critically about museums, is because, I remember I was at the Met in the Modern Contemporary department, and I remember thinking about like, there's some very interesting missing holes in our collection, and why, for instance, there's nothing that's like critical of the oil industry. There's nothing that's critical of, certain types of corporations. And then you realize who's on the board, and you realize that they wouldn't approve acquisitions like that. So there is some degree of, no one's going to admit this, but it's very clearly the case, a censorship that happens when you have that power dynamic of a board deciding what becomes part of an art collection or what events a museum does. So that is something that if anyone's, thinking about power dynamics and boards, it's really important to know about. But in any case, this is like all to say that we're going to submit our documents, then we get assessed by our facilities. They look and see if we're, if our actions meet what we're saying. Like if we've outlined a mission statement of X, Y, and Z, are we actually doing things that meet in terms of that? They might point out issues with facilities. They might tell us, oh, did you know that, storage concerns or anything like that? Or they might point out things where we just need improvement on certain documentation. I don't know yet. We haven't done it, so we're going to find out what it's going to be, but it's a long process. It doesn't happen overnight. It usually takes at least 2 years to work through, and we're just at the beginnings of it. But and then you get reaccredited every 7 years. So it's not just a one time and you're done, but it's every 7 years you kind of go through the cycle again. The first time's the hardest, obviously, because you're just starting, but it's still a big undertaking each time.
What does accreditation get you in this? Like, if you're not accredited as an academic unit, then like your degree is meaningless, essentially. What's kind of at stake with that for you?
Well, I mean, some places say they don't need accreditation. They don't do it. It helps with grants. It makes us a lot more competitive for grants because it's a kind of a seal of approval. If we've never applied for a grant and someone sees our name and they're like, you're not accredited, I don't really know what they're doing. Versus if we are, it kind of shows, okay, they are meeting our industry standards. We also have a museum studies program. So it will mean that, that will help them too, say like they were trained somewhere that meets industry standards. But a big part of it is it offers us protection because, to become accredited would mean that the university will sign our code of ethics and the AAM, so the accrediting body's code of ethics. And that also means like, they can't sell. I mean, I'm sure you've heard about the Rose Museum at Brandeis or different places where a university suddenly decides we need money. What's a good solution? We'll sell the art museum. And that's essentially the museum, the university committing that they will not see the art collection as an asset that they can just dispose of, but rather as an important, resource for the university and the larger community. So that's a big kind of part of it, but it raises our profile nationally. It helps us attract more funding. It's going to be in many ways, it's going to be a pain to do, but it's going to pay off in many ways. And also it attracts donors because, if I'm going to give you my big art collection, but I don't know, you're not accredited, and I don't know if someone's going to turn around to sell it to fund a building, I'm probably going to hold off versus if I know you're accredited and you're the real deal, then I'll be more comfortable.
Vanya, I was wondering, you said that, I mean, you were talking about power issues and the way that the collections are collected. And some of them sort of have a problematic, tracing the provenance can be an issue. Is there any discussion of returning any of the art and the discussions, on the academic discussions that might go along with such decisions?
I think in our institution so far, no, but I think that's only because people haven't researched it yet. And that's why I want people to research it. And I think if that is, if indeed we should return it, that's what we should do. Other academic institutions, a lot of times they don't initiate the research. People reach out to them and say, hey, you have this and you shouldn't have it. And then lawsuits can ensue and larger discussions. And ultimately the museum oftentimes does return it, not always. And there's whole people they're attorneys and they're trained in this very specific field. But, I think as an academic museum, we want to be doing the right thing. And we want our students and our community to be able to research the collection. And if there are problems about where it should be, that's a learning opportunity for all of us to be able to realize that, there's an issue with where this shouldn't be here, and to research how do we return it in the right way. And then we can all learn from that. And that certainly happened at many different academic museums. But like I said, it often hasn't been self-initiated. It often comes that someone comes to them and says, and as museum collections have become more discoverable, like we just launched eMuseum, which is an online platform, so that when you Google something now that's in our collection, our collection will come up with a link to that artwork. So it didn't, like a few months ago, that wasn't the case. So what that means is as collections become more discoverable, more people globally are going to be able to say, oh, this came up and I realized you have something that maybe you shouldn't have, versus before when it was so insular that you'd have to talk to a staff member and really pursue us and do research to find out. A lot of times you wouldn't know. So I think just because of the discoverability and the digitization of these collections, this topic will become more and more in the forefront for us. And it's not just, culture, it's World War II is a big one too. A lot of works, I'm sure most of you have seen in the newspaper, a lot of works that are from that era or even before that era, but that moved during that period, were taken under duress, were stolen. And then, people who took it would hold on to it for a long time, knowing there's some ethical issues, and then they die. And then their children have no idea sometimes what, the ethical issues of these work. And then they donate it to a museum who gladly takes it. And then someone sees it on the website and says, wait, that shouldn't be here. And there's even a database of stolen art that, you can access. There's a really good documentary that I would encourage you all, I think it's on Netflix, to see, called The Rape of Europa. And it talks about the looting of art museums and of private collections too that happened during World War II. And a really wonderful story too about how the Mona Lisa was in hiding with a family from the museum. And the little girl, she still was alive during that interview, talks about knowing that it was in this suitcase essentially. But it's pretty crazy to see even the pictures of how they cleaned out the Louvre to hide everything from Hitler, from the Nazis. And then a lot of times some of that stuff got lost, some people got stolen, and same with personal families, people took from them. So it's definitely still a very unresolved issue with a lot of art, especially now coming up, that generations are cycling over.
Okay, what you're saying is quite familiar to me. I come from Kenya, and some time back, there was some prolonged court battle of a pre-colonial traditional leader regalia, which was somehow taken by colonialists and stored somewhere in UK. It took long for the courts to decide that the regalia had to be brought back. I don't know, what is the procedure? Is it that the court must intervene for the museum to release the whatever artifact that has to be taken back, or there should be some agreement that once the owner has identified it and there's some ethical issues surrounding it, it should be released immediately?
I agree with you. I think in our case, it would be with the museum here, it would be my decision, and then maybe I'd have to clear it by the administration because it technically we are part of Syracuse and that is its asset, right? But I don't think we would have that same issue. The British Museum in particular has been notorious with not returning art, things that don't belong to them, quite frankly. So in the UK, it's the museum that says, no, we don't want to give it back. And when the museum says, no, we don't want to give it back, then the only solution is to go to court. And then the court decides. But I think in many cases, I mean, I would say in our case, like the museum would say, yes, we do want to give it back. And then there would be no need to go to court. It would just be an arrangement of returning the works.
Then what happens? We have stories that we were given a replica, a copy of what we wanted. Is there a possibility that someone can still pursue, maybe can still seek legal redress if you wanted the original thing that was taken?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
There is, absolutely there is. And there, I mean, like I said, there's whole people whose field is to study the law of this. But even people who during World War II got money for an artwork, like let's say someone says, you have to sell this to me, I'll give you $5,000, but it's worth $100,000. And they have a gun to my head. So I say, okay, because I want to live. Even though they say, well, Vanya accepted money for it and it was sold, and she signed, now that work is being returned to those families because it's done under duress. So it wasn't you weren't on equal playing field. You were, the opposite of that, right? And so that's not binding.
Okay.
Yeah, but there's a lot of research and conversation and even conferences and talks being done on this topic, and it's very, very relevant right now.
How about there was a time I watched a film by some gentleman from Southern Africa about the gods must be crazy. I don't know whether you are well versed with this. I think that has been stored in some museums and it has really sold a lot, but the gentleman seems disenfranchised. Is there a possibility that the gentleman can seek redress? Maybe the museums compensate him, or maybe the people whom they did the business with could compensate him or something else.
Maybe. Yeah, I think that's a case-by-case situation. I don't know. I know that sometimes there's a great movie about Klimt, the painter Klimt, and the legal case that came out of that. It was, I think, the niece of the woman who her portrait was painted, and then I forget who died. Maybe she died, and then her husband, they just took his art. Maybe they gave him some money, but they took it by force. And she was unsuccessful in, I think this was in Austria, in suing because they went to the museum in Vienna. She was unsuccessful through Austria to sue the museum. They said oh no, we have some legal statute and you can't, whatever, this has been resolved. But she went to the United States of America where she had, I forget, it was someone she knew or some friend, an attorney, and she sued from America to have it returned, and she was able to get it returned. So sometimes it's also where a lawsuit originates, because the courts were forced to actually try it in the United States rather than Vienna. And because of that, it was a different outcome than if they tried it in Vienna. So again, this is beyond my expertise because I'm no attorney, but I do know it's a very complicated topic and there are many ways about seeking recourse. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. It's a fascinating topic. Well, I'm so thrilled you all joined and that we were able to connect, and I hope that we'll continue to stay in touch and that you'll feel you can reach out to me directly if you have any questions about the collection and teaching with it, and I'm always here to help.
Thank you, Vanya, so much. This was very, very great. It was very informative.
Thank you.
Thank
you.
Enjoy the weekend, everyone.
Take care, everyone.